Greetings. Today we'll be looking at chapters 14 and 15. And the big question in front of you should be, is the creature a monster? What makes a monster a monster? So I'd like you to start off just thinking about that, jotting down some ideas of what makes something a monster. And notice I'm saying what makes something a monster. Are they born or are they made? So the creature clearly is considered a monster by our society today. But based on the story, does he see himself as a monster, or is that how others see? So just take a moment and think about that. With 14 and 15 here, we're going to learn the backstory of the family from whom the creature is learning. They're called the Delacey Family. And there's a difference between the Arab, Safi, and the creature. And part of it is just looks. And we're going to see how that plays out in society, some of the truisms that come through in there. So let's begin with chapter 14. There may be some quizzes coming up too, so make sure you check them periodically, either on Socrative or Ed Puzzles, etc. So here we go, chapter 14. Again, this is the creature telling his story. Now, he's going to tell us a story within a story. So we have another frame here that's going to come up. So we actually have Walton telling a story to his sister through the well, actually we have Walton's sister sharing with us a story she got from her brother, who's sharing a story he got from Victor, who's sharing a story he got from the creature, who's now sharing a story that you'll find out later he shares with Victor that he got from the Delaceys. So our frame story, it's a frame within a frame within a frame. All right. Creature talking here. Some time elapsed before I learned the history of my friends. You notice how he calls them friends. There's another good question. What makes a friend a friend? It was one which could not fail to impress itself deeply on my mind, unfolding as it did a number of circumstances, each interesting and wonderful to one so utterly inexperienced as I was. The name of the old man was Delacey. He descended from a good family in France, where he lived for many years in affluence, respected by his superiors and beloved by his equals. His son was bred in the service of his country, and Agatha had ranked with ladies of the highest distinction. A few months before my arrival, they had lived in a large and luxurious city called Paris, surrounded by friends and possessed of every enjoyment which virtue, refinement of intellect, or taste, accompanied by a moderate fortune, could afford. So how did they end up in this hovel? The father of Safi had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant and inhabited Paris for many years, when, for some reason which I could not learn, he became obnoxious to the government. He was seized and cast into prison the very day that Safi arrived from Constantinople to join him. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was very flagrant. All Paris was indignant, and it was judged that his religion and wealth, rather than the crime alleged against him, had been the cause of his condemnation. Hey, so glad that the world's not like that anymore, right? Not. But again, Mary Shelley making a commentary about our justice systems and the idea of what is a fair trial or not. And even then, when the people realize it, is there anything we can really do? Felix had accidentally been present at the trial. His horror and indignation were uncontrollable when he heard the decision of the court. He made at that moment a solemn vow to deliver him, and then looked around for the means. After many fruitless attempts to gain admittance to the prison, he found a strongly grated window in an unguarded part of the building, which lighted the dungeon and the unfortunate Mohammedan. In other words, he's a follower of Islam, and that's where they were saying that maybe his religion played a part in the sentencing against him, who, loaded with chains, waited in despair for the execution of the barbarous sentence. Felix visited the grate at night and made known to the prisoner his intentions in his favor. The Turk, amazed and delighted, endeavored to kindle the zeal of his deliverer by promises of reward and wealth. Felix rejected his offers with contempt. Yet when he saw the lovely Safi, who was allowed to visit her father, and who by her gestures expressed her lively gratitude, the youth could not help owning to his own mind that the captive possessed a treasure which would fully reward his toil and hazard. The Turk quickly perceived the impression that his daughter had made on the heart of Felix, and endeavored to secure him more entirely in his interest by the promise of her hand in marriage, so soon as he should be conveyed to a place of safety. Felix was too delicate to accept this offer, yet he looked forward to the probability of the event as to the consummation of his happiness. Again, what becomes a motive? Originally, Felix is motivated by a sense of injustice and trying to make things right. But then he sees, maybe there's something else too. So now it becomes personal. During the ensuing days, while the preparations were going forward for the escape of the merchant, the zeal of Felix was warmed by several letters they received from this lovely girl, who found means to express her thoughts in the language of her lover by the aid of an old man, a servant of her father who understood French. She thanked him in the most ardent terms for his intended services toward her parent, and at the same time she gently deplored her own fate. So now we have an idea of what language the creature is learning. It sounds like they must be speaking French, and Safi is speaking some other language. I have copies of these letters, for I found means during my residence in the hovel to procure implements of writing, and the letters were often in the hands of Felix or Agatha. Before I depart, I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. But at present, as the sun is already far declined, I shall only have time to repeat the substance of them to you. That's the creature talking to Victor as they're sitting there. Just a reminder for the reader that the creature is telling us, and it establishes the ethos of the creature. He's not making this up. He has evidence. Safi related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safi, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion, in other words, Christianity, and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. Mary Shelley, remember, her mother's Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first feminists, so she's modeling in a way, I think, her own. She's bringing in people she knows, and this could be like her mother, and she being kind of like Safi, this idea of female independence. The lady died, which happened to Mary Shelley. Her mother dies when she's young. But her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safi, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia and being immured within the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with infantile amusements. In other words, a slave, and she wants something more than that. Ill-suited to the temper of her soul, now accustomed to grand ideas and a noble emulation for virtue, the prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her. The day for the execution of the Turk was fixed, but on the night previous to it he quitted his prison and before morning was distant many leagues from Paris. Felix had procured passports in the name of his father, sister, and himself. He had previously communicated his plan to the former, who aided the deceit by quitting his house under the pretense of a journey and concealed himself with his daughter in an obscure part of Paris. Felix conducted the fugitives through France to Lyon and across Mont Cenis to Leghorn, where the merchant had decided to wait a favorable opportunity of passing into some part of the Turkish dominions. Safi resolved to remain with her father until the moment of his departure, before which time the Turk renewed his promise that she should be united to his deliverer, and Felix remained with them in expectation of that event. And in the meantime he enjoyed the society of the Arabian, who had exhibited towards him the simplest and tenderest affection. They conversed with one another through the means of an interpreter, and sometimes with the interpretation of looks, and Safi sang to him the divine airs of her native country. The Turk allowed this intimacy to take place and encouraged the hopes of the youthful lovers, while in his heart he had formed far other plans. He loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian, but he feared the resentment of Felix if he should appear lukewarm, for he knew that if he was still in the power of his deliverer, if he should choose to betray him to the Italian state which they inhabited, he resolved 1,000 plans by which he should be enabled to prolong the deceit until it might be no longer necessary, and secretly to take his daughter with him when he departed. His plans were facilitated by the news which arrived from Paris. So this guy is not being honest. What kind of thanks will Felix get? The government of France were greatly enraged at the escape of their victim and spared no pains to detect and punish his deliverer. The plot of Felix was quickly discovered, and Delacey and Agatha were thrown into prison. The news reached Felix and roused him from his dream of pleasure. His blind and aged father and his gentle sister lay in a noisome dungeon, while he enjoyed the free air and the society of her whom he loved. This idea was torture to him. He quickly arranged with the Turk that if the latter should find a favorable opportunity for escape before Felix could return to Italy, Safie should remain as a boarder at a convent at Leghorn, and then quitting the lovely Arabian, he hastened to Paris and delivered himself up to the vengeance of the law, hoping to free Delacey and Agatha by this proceeding. Kind of interesting. How were they discovered? It's kind of implied maybe Safie's father revealed it, and knowing that Felix should go back. He did not succeed. They remained confined for 5 months before the trial took place, the result of which deprived them of their fortune and condemned them to a perpetual exile from their native country. They found a miserable asylum in the cottage in Germany where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the treacherous Turk, for whom he and his family endured such unheard of oppression, on discovering that his deliverer was thus reduced to poverty and ruin, became a traitor to good feeling and honor, and had quitted Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a pittance of money to aid him, as he said, in some plan of future maintenance. People are cruel. You're going to see this come up over and over again in this story. Such were the events that preyed on the heart of Felix, rendered him, when I first saw him, the most miserable of his family. He could have endured poverty, and while his distress had been the meed of his virtue, he gloried in it. But the ingratitude of the Turk and the loss of his beloved Safie were misfortunes more bitter and irreparable. The arrival of the Arabian now infused new life into his soul. When the news reached Leghorn that Felix was deprived of his wealth and rank, the merchant commanded his daughter to think no more of her lover, but to prepare to return to her native country. The generous nature of Safie was outraged by this command. She attempted to expostulate with her father, but he left her angrily, reiterating his tyrannical mandate. A few days after, the Turk entered his daughter's apartment and told her hastily that he had reason to believe that his residence at Leghorn had been divulged, and that he should speedily be delivered up to the French government. He had consequently hired a vessel to convey him to Constantinople, for which city he should sail in a few hours. He intended to leave his daughter under the care of a confidential servant, to follow at her leisure with the greater part of his property, which had not yet arrived at Leghorn. When alone, Safie resolved in her own mind the plan of conduct that it would become her to pursue in this emergency. A residency in Turkey was abhorrent to her. Her religion and her feelings were alike averse to it. By some papers of her father, which fell into her hands, she heard of the exile of her lover, and learnt the name of the spot where he then resided. She's such a good writer. Mary Shelley fills in all the gaps. It's hard to find holes in her story. Well, how did she figure out where Felix was staying? There you go. It's right there. And the same thing comes up, too, with the creature later, too. This story's so well written. She hesitated some time, but at length she formed her determination. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her and a sum of money, she quitted Italy with an attendant, a native of Leghorn, but who understood the common language of Turkey, and departed for Germany. She arrived in safety at a town about 20 leagues from the cottage of Delacey, when her attendant fell dangerously ill. Safie nursed her with the most devoted affection, but the poor girl died, and the Arabian was left alone. Unacquainted with the language of the country, and utterly ignorant of the customs of the world, she fell, however, into good hands. The Italian had mentioned the name of the spot for which they were bound, and after her death, the woman of the house in which they had lived took care that Safie should arrive in safety at the cottage of her lover. So thus, the other person that arrived with her wasn't her attendant. So it's well done. The story's well done. Why is this story here? What does this have to do with anything? What does it show us? Take a moment and think about it. Chapter 15. So, I'll just give you a clue. It demonstrates to the creature the idea once more about true love and friendship. We see that with Robert Walton and one of the guys that he hires to be on a ship, the guy who gives everything for the happiness. What are people willing to sacrifice? So the poor creature. Such was the history of my beloved cottagers. It impressed me deeply. I learned from the views of social life which it developed to admire their virtues and to deprecate the vices of mankind. As yet I looked upon crime as a distant evil. Benevolence and generosity were ever present before me, inciting within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene, where so many admirable qualities were called forth and displayed. But in giving account of the progress of my intellect, I must not omit a circumstance which occurred in the beginning of the month of August of the same year. One night, during my accustomed visit to the neighboring wood, where I collected my own food and brought home firing for my protectors, I found on the ground a leather portmanteau, it's like a briefcase, containing several articles of dress and some books. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, the books were written in the language, the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories, whilst my friends were employed in their ordinary occupations. I can hardly describe to you the effects of these books. They produced to me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. In the Sorrows of Werther, besides the interest of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto to me been obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. The gentle and domestic manners it described, combined with lofty sentiments and feelings, which had for their object something out of self, accorded well with my experience among my protectors, and with the wants which were forever alive in my own bosom. But I thought Werther himself, or Werther, a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sank deep. The disquisitions upon death and suicide were calculated to fill me with wonder. I did not pretend to enter into the merits of the case, yet I inclined towards the opinions of the hero, whose extinction I wept, without precisely understanding it. Maybe a little foreshadowing there, huh? As I read, however, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike to the beings concerning whom I read and to whose conversation I was a listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but was unformed in mind. I was dependent on none and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. He realizes if he dies, no one will notice it. There's no one to lament his annihilation. Wow. And yet at the same time, he's free. He's not bound by the other things that most people are bound. My person was hideous and my nature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. Those are questions for everybody, huh? What does this mean? Who am I? What am I? From where did I come? And what is my future? The volume of Plutarch's Lives, which I possess, contained the histories of the first founders of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me from the Sorrows of Werther. I learned from Werther's imaginations, despondency and gloom, but Plutarch taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections, to admire and love the heroes of past ages. Many things I read surpassed my understanding experience. I had a very confused knowledge of kingdoms, wide extents of country, mighty rivers and boundless seas, but I was perfectly unacquainted with towns and large assemblages of man. The cottage of my own protectors had been my only school, in which I had studied human nature. But this book developed new and mightier scenes of action. I read of men concerned in public affairs, governing or massacring their species. I felt the greatest ardor for virtue rise within me, and abhorrence for vice. Virtue, the good; vice, the things we give into, the bad. As far as I understood the signification of those terms, relative as they were, as I applied them to pleasure and pain alone, induced by these feelings, I was of course led to admire peaceable lawgivers, Numa, Solon, Lycurgus, in preference to Romulus and Theseus. The patriarchal lives of my protectors caused these impressions to take a firm hold on my mind. Perhaps if my first introduction to humanity had been made by a young soldier burning for glory and slaughter, I should have been imbued with different sensations. Wow. So he's studying history, and he's understanding that people are more than just our experiences. And if you think about it, that is what learning really is about. Part of it, it's experience. But if all we do is stay where we've ever lived and we're around the people for whom we've only lived, and we only get information from the sources that we're given, then we'll never know anything beyond that. And that's why it's good to go out and try and experience other places and read other things. We don't have to agree with them, but they expand our horizon, that the world is bigger than just our perception of our immediate area and our friends. So the creature realizes that. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read other volumes which had fallen into my hands as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. All-powerful God warring with his creatures. It's an interesting thought. I often referred to several situations, and their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. But his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the special care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Remember earlier, Victor talked about his parents having provided for him a perfect childhood? What kind of parent is Victor to the creature? What has he done for the thing that he's created? He rejected it. He runs away and utterly alone. Those are the first experiences the creature has. He's not even like Adam. He's alone. Wow. Another circumstance strengthened and confirmed these feelings. Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your laboratory. At first I had neglected them, but now that I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written, I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. This history was mingled with accounts of domestic occurrences. You doubtless recollect these papers. Here they are, and he shows them to Victor. He actually has them. Everything you related in them, which bears reference to my accursed origin, the whole detail of that series of disgusting circumstances which produced it, is set in view. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine indelible. I sickened as I read, quote, "Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony, 'Accursed Creator! Why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred.'" Wow. So he asks the question, where did I come from? Now he knows. What were the feelings of those who preceded him? And he has anger, and justifiably so. So he does see himself now as a monster. These were the reflections of my hours of despondency and solitude. But when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers, their amiable and benevolent dispositions, I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me and overlook my personal deformity. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? I resolved at least not to despair, but in every way to fit myself for an interview with them which would decide my fate. I postponed this attempt for some months longer, for the importance attached to its success inspired me with a dread lest I should fail. Besides, I found that my understanding improved so much with every day's experience that I was unwilling to commence this undertaking until a few more months should have added to my sage wiseness, wisdom. He's going to reveal himself to the cottagers. I mean, how can they reject him? They are good people. They're full of virtue. They should take pity on him. Several changes in the meantime took place in the cottage. The presence of Safie diffused happiness among its inhabitants, and I also found that a greater degree of plenty reigned there. Felix and Agatha spent more time in amusement and conversation, and were assisted in their labors by servants. They did not appear rich, but they were contented and happy. Their feelings were serene and peaceful, while mine became every day more tumultuous. Increase of knowledge only discovered to me more clearly what a wretched outcast was I. I cherished hope, it is true, but it vanished when I beheld my person reflected in water, or my shadow in the moonshine, even that frail image in that inconstant shade. I endeavored to crush these fears and to fortify myself for the trial which in a few months I resolved to undergo. And sometimes I allowed my thoughts, unchecked by reason, to ramble in the fields of paradise, and dared to fancy amiable and lovely creatures sympathizing with my feelings and cheering my gloom. Their angelic countenances breathed smiles of consolation. But it was all a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows, nor shared my thoughts. I was alone. I remembered Adam's supplication to his Creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. So he's basically revealing to Victor, as he's telling us, Adam was given a companion. Where's my companion? Huh? And he's sitting right across from Victor. Where's mine? You know, I need somebody. I'm alone. So we'll do part 2 here in a moment. At the end here, what is the power of loneliness? How does it affect an individual? And what's Mary Shelley saying about it? In a way, is that's what's contributing to his nature of being monstrous. So, jot down your thoughts. You might even share them on this YouTube video. You don't have to. But you do need to write them in there. And we'll start part 2 in a moment.